Defense Secretary Ashton Carter says it appears Russian airstrikes hit areas in Syria where ISIS is not present. In a news conference today, Carter said Russia's position in Syria is contradictory and will only inflame the country's civil war. He went on to say Russia's actions, quote, are ill-advised without pursuing a political transition away from the Assad regime.
Fighting ISIL without pursuing a parallel political transition only risks escalating the civil war in Syria, and with it, the very extremism and instability that Moscow claims to be concerned about and aspire to fighting. So that approach, is tantamount, as I said then, to pouring gasoline on the fire.
Secretary Carter also said the U.S.-led coalition will continue its operations to root out ISIS in Syria. It's that plan that Senator John McCain criticized today on the Senate floor. McCain said a lack of leadership from the Obama administration is the reason Russia launched airstrikes.
This administration has confused our friends, encouraged our enemies, mistaken an excess of caution for prudence, and replaced the risks of action with the perils of inaction. Into the wreckage of this administration's Middle East policy has now stepped Vladimir Putin. It requires self-delusion of tremendous scale to believe that Russia and Iran have any interest in resolving the Syrian conflict. They seek only to keep the murderous Assad regime in power.
Earlier, I spoke with senior national security correspondent David Martin about the airstrikes.
The U.S. has counted 8 Russian planes that took off from that air base in western Syria and struck targets in the city of Homs, which is also in western Syria. The U.S. found out these strikes were about to happen when a Russian official walked into the U.S. embassy in Baghdad and said the strikes would begin in an hour and to keep all American aircraft away from the scene of the strikes. That was not a problem because American aircraft operate mainly over eastern Syria, which is where ISIS operates, and these strikes that the Russians flew were in western Syria. The problem here is that although Vladimir Putin has talked about joining an anti-ISIS coalition, these airstrikes were not against any targets in territory held by ISIS. These airstrikes were against targets in areas held by other opposition groups that are trying to overthrow the Assad regime. So these airstrikes were designed to prop up the Assad regime, strengthen his position, and that is a major game changer because Assad's position has been steadily weakening through the course of this civil war, and he was in a position where he would have to negotiate less and less from a position of strength and more from a position of weakness. If the Russians are there to prop him up, he will be able to once again negotiate from a position of strength, and this is almost certainly likely to prolong the Syrian civil war.
Senior national security analyst Juan Zarate also weighed in earlier today.
Yeah, the Russians have been incredibly clear and direct about their interests and what they're trying to do in Syria. They haven't minced words, especially recently, and they've demonstrated with their shift of very real resources to include their fighter aircraft to Syria recently, that they were going to defend Assad and engage much more aggressively and directly in the fight to not only prop him up, but in their minds to also fight his opponents. The challenge for the U.S. is that the Russians are now dictating the realities on the ground. They're creating complications for our own actions and coalition. You've heard from the Defense Secretary the concern over deconfliction, which is real. And you now have the Russians, in many ways, putting Moscow at the center of the universe when it comes to what happens in Syria, something they've done before and they're doing again.
So Then this idea that they are not essentially hitting the areas where ISIS is most active, but they are hitting the areas where some of the coalition, for example, the Free Syrian Army is operating, including perhaps some of those the Kurd fighters. I mean, that to me says essentially that they are there just to prop up Assad, and it doesn't matter what happens with ISIS.
Right. I mean, that's not surprising either. The Russians have an interest to fight all of Assad's enemies. And as we've seen from what the Assad regime has done, the Assad regime actually had some accommodations with the Islamic State early on and was fighting the more moderate rebels from the get-go, hitting them in places like Homs and Mosul and other parts of the country. And so it's really not a surprise that the Russians, if they're hitting targets that matter to Assad, are not necessarily hitting ISIS targets. The Russians are certainly concerned about extremism. They're concerned legitimately over Chechens and Dagestanis and others who've joined the forces in ISIS and may come back to fight. But they're there for a larger purpose, which is to defend Assad, defend their own interests, and that means going after all of his enemies. And unfortunately, what we have are some of America's allies on the ground likely going to be targets of Russian action, which presents a whole host of complications for the U.S.
Juan, and we haven't been talking a whole lot about this, but what about some of the other groups that are there in support of the Assad regime, talking specifically Hezbollah, talking specifically the rest of the military that Assad seems to have under his control in the western portion of this country? Any indication at all, not just Hezbollah, but Iran itself is involved in coordinating anything with the Russians?
Absolutely. And Vlad, to your first question, the Russians are being very explicit about this. In the wake of shifting assets to Syria, they just announced as well the intelligence sharing cooperative with the Iraqi government, with the Syrian government, and with the Iranians. And so in some ways, the Russians are creating their own coalition, their own alliance to support the Assad regime and to change facts on the ground and, frankly, to change the narrative. The narrative from Vladimir Putin is, look, we're the ones fighting for stability. We're the ones who have legitimacy. We're the ones who are flying sorties on behalf of the legitimate government in Syria. What we heard him say to Charlie Rose the other night was, look, what we've done, what the U.S. has done to remove regimes has created great instability in places like Libya and Iraq, et cetera. So we are there as the legitimate actors, and they're doing it in concert with the Iranians, with Hezbollah, with Syria. Again, there's no secret to this. There's no secret to Hezbollah's activities. They've been very open about sending fighters to defend Assad and to fight forces there. And the Iranians have been very explicit. And so this is happening in plain sight, and the battle space is changing before our very eyes.
Juan, before I let you go, explain to our viewers, if Iran is supporting the Assad regime in Syria and they are aligning themselves with Russia and, of course, implicitly providing material to Hezbollah, but yet in Iraq, they are fighting against ISIS there. We're sort of partners in that endeavor. How does that work?
Well, it's complicated. There are so many different actors on the ground. You look at the groups in Syria, there are hundreds of them that have splintered and are fighting both each other and the Assad regime. And in Iraq, of course, you have the Iraqi government, which is supported by the U.S., but also supported by the Iranian government, fighting the Islamic State and elements that control vast swaths of their territory, to include Mosul, which is the second largest city in the country. And so there are going to be parallel interests between the U.S. and Russia and Iran. The problem, though, Vlad, is even though you have that coincidence of interests, for example, fighting the Islamic State, the way that the Russians are going about it, the way that the Iranians are, really does potentially undermine U.S. interests. And so that creates great complications for the military, for our State Department, as well as for the White House.
And one, I lied. I said I would let you go after this question, but I have another one real quick.
I love talking to you, Vlad.
I know.
Okay.
It's always so great, and it's always so insightful. So this idea that the United States and Israel were alerted to this by the Russians, but some of the other coalition partners, France, for example, expressing surprise that this was happening. What's behind that?
Well, the Russians didn't notify apparently until about an hour before their airstrikes were to begin. Part of that probably for operational control, part of it to sort of keep their options available. The French are probably worried because, as you know, Vlad, the French have begun to take their own strikes and to use their own fighter aircraft in Syria, in airspace where the Russians are now flying. And so The French, just like the Americans and other coalition partners, are worried about deconfliction. They certainly don't want to be the target of Russian aircraft, and they certainly don't want inadvertent miscommunication to cause the downing of a French aircraft. And so the problem is the skies over Syria are growing more crowded. The Russians are now dictating a good bit of this. And now the U.S. has to coordinate not only within its own coalition, but also now with Russia. That includes France as well.
Do our partners, the Free Syrian Army, the YPG, the PKK, are they going to turn around to the United States and say, hey, you're not protecting us from some of these airstrikes? What's going on?
Well, it's a great question, Vlad, because we have had that problem with respect to Assad and the actions he's been taking, the horrific chemical attacks, the barrel bombs, and concerns that the U.S. hasn't done enough to defend the interest in places like Aleppo and other parts of Syria that have been targets of Assad's regime. Now that you have the Russians coming in with perhaps more firepower, with more devastation, hitting U.S. allies or putative U.S. allies, you are going to have this question of, does the U.S. have to defend its allies more directly? This has long-term implications, because if we are to affect what's happening on the ground politically, we have to have allies, proxies, those that are able to actually fight with our interests in mind as well. If they're getting decimated by Russian airstrikes, this isn't just a matter of deconfliction anymore. This is actually a matter of direct conflict that we've got to worry about.
Juan Zarate, reporting from Washington. Juan, thank you for your analysis as always. We appreciate it.
Thank you, Vlad.